cool. Everything's working. All right. Good morning, afternoon, evening, or whatever it is for you. I'm Brent, an author, amateur world builder, writing educator. You can find me as werewolf-dr on Threads, Instagram, Patreon, Ko-Fi, and YouTube, as well as here, or werewolf-dr on Bluesky. Today, aside from everything else going on, today I'm thinking, or was thinking, depending on what chat, if there is chat. Oh, I'm make sure I gotta put my links in chat. Speaking of chat, there we go. I was thinking about looking at the where society's geography kind of come together when we're looking at secondary worlds in particular. However, we can expand this out into kind of generic world building geography, and also into both secondary versus primary world geography, and the fun things we can play with even with primary world geography. So I think on that note, and hello to whoever joined with chat. Lurkers are great. Lurkers are fine. Although interaction is also kind of fun and nice. If you feel up to that right now. If not, that's okay too. So when we're looking at geography, thinking about geography, I think it's a good idea to look at, first off, scale. And we can look at geography in terms of, I think, 4 different broad scales, or levels of scale. The largest, you get the continental, which we look at with all of the many of the various maps and fantasy books and that sort of thing. We're familiar with that from gaming materials, all that sort of stuff. We have national geography, which goes into both the physical layouts of the land in terms of things like forests, mountains, lakes, rivers, all that stuff, but also things like cities and possible political geography, potentially sub breakdowns within a nation. We got regional, which may be a part of a nation, a kind of zoomed in version of part of it, and we've got local, which will be whatever the place and then the things immediately around it, potentially, or even just the place itself. This could be broken down even further, potentially. Like if we're working with a city, we might even have like a neighborhood or a kind of regional map regional geography within a city. These can be things like both the physical, mostly it's going to be the physical layout, where you're going to have things like what kind of geographic features are present even in the city, even in like a city or a town or a village, because we're going to have potentially streams, rivers, ponds, lakes. We may have wooded areas. We may have islands. We may have hills. We may have all kinds of things like that. And these are going to affect various things about the society and about the city, the location itself. Good example of that. Couple good examples of that. In Rome, there were the so-called 7 hills of Rome, or the hills of Rome, where you had the various hills that made up the city that each had their own, in the ancient era at least, had their own kind of special affiliations or associations with the society and whatnot. So you had go ahead and just let this down. So you had the things like the Palatine Hill, where all the rich people lived, and all that's where you had rich people living and government stuff and that sort of thing. And you had other hills that had other types of neighborhoods affiliated with them or associated with them. Where I grew up, city I grew up in, the river was very, very important River going through the city was very important geographically, and in terms of shaping the city and shaping the culture of the city. As were there were various hills and such that also had things coming into play there. And we can go beyond just the presence. Well, actually, that's not even beyond. We have the presence of a major lake, which had a lot of effect in terms of climate and in terms of or not climate but local weather, and in terms of how people respond to things and how the culture in the city developed in a lot of ways. So one of the questions that comes to mind in looking at things with this is the idea of fantasy geography versus realism geography. And which way you want to go with it can depend on the kind of feel of the setting or the theme of the setting or whatnot. So if we want a more realistic type world, then paying some attention to kind of the realities of our own geography can be helpful. And that includes things like how mountains are formed, which directions they go, how rivers work, and all that sort of stuff. That gets into a lot of things like geology, climatology, meteorology, physics, all of those fun things. Or at least looking very closely at a variety of maps of our own world. However, when we look outside of our world, when we're looking at other parts of the universe, places where we have sent we haven't really sent satellites to the universe as such, probes, but we look at other planets in our system, we look at other moons in our system, when we look at various planets we have found with telescopes and whatnot, we find that our knowledge of geology is relatively limited in that it's mostly focused on our own world and what we see in our own world. Because we have found in the last 20 years, 25 years, planets that are theoretically formed of diamond outside in other solar systems, around other stars. We have found massive Earth-like planets that, 30, 40 years ago, people would have said, no, that's not possible. We found a whole bunch of bizarre things out there, or what we presume are bizarre things based on the data that we're able to collect from however many hundreds of light years away. And that gets into all kinds of sciences that I personally have no background in. But I trust the various experts who over at NASA and whatnot, and the European Space Agency and such, who are looking at this data, or who are at various places working with people in those agencies to look at this data. So when we're looking kind of for realism, we definitely want to be it's going to take some research. We're going to want to look into various things. We're going to want to look into things like maybe maps of various parts of the world are probably the easiest to work with. We might, depending on how you work with things and how important it is, you might get more detailed into things like picking up some basics of geology, climatology, all that fun stuff. When we're talking about secondary worlds, fantasy worlds, not Earth worlds, all that goes out the window unless we want a more realistic setting. If we're not really too concerned about the sort of quote-unquote realism of the world, that in some regards, then you can pretty much do whatever you want, really, with fantasy geography. Partially because not only is it a different world, it's a different universe, it's potentially a different reality. So a lot of things that we would say are kind of realistic for based on our own history, our own geography, our own geology and such, basically can potentially go out the window. Because part of that could be that perhaps this fantasy world doesn't have plate tectonics. Well, without plate tectonics, then we say, okay, how did mountains form? Well, mountains form because whatever in-world reason comes into play. And if mountains form for a reason that is not plate tectonics, then that gives us, among other things, then that gives us more leeway to do a lot of different things with them. One of the biggest arguments one of the big things that you see floating around every so often is that Tolkien's world, Middle Earth, is problematic because of how some rivers flow, but more importantly because of the mountains around Mordor. My response to this is, and this goes back to the Silmarillion, that the mountains around Mordor are inherently not natural mountains, because they are part of a fantasy world, and they are also, but more importantly, because the Silmarillion tells us that semi-divine agents acted upon the world and created those mountains, so they could make them whatever shape they darn well pleased. So when we're looking at some of that stuff, we can see that, yeah, we can have some variety. We can go beyond the kind of realistic. We can get into some imaginative and creative things going into play. And shapes of mountains are not necessarily the most imaginative in that regard, but they are a sort of opening stage, if you will. So there are a lot of different ways that even natural geography can be modified when we're looking at particularly secondary worlds. And I'm going to focus mostly on secondary worlds, which is non-Earth worlds, because there's a lot more going on with that. Towards the end of things, I'll talk about some primary world, Earth related, for like urban fantasy and that sort of thing, or historical fantasy. But when we're dealing with altering geography, there are a lot of different factors that can come into play. The most obvious one that could come into there to shape geography, change geography in different ways, is divine intervention. Basically, if the divinities of a world say that we want this to work this way, then it's going to work that way. So that could be things like you have more of a, we'll say, Middle Earth style thing where the gods change things around, or semi-divine beings change things around. It's basically angelic figures, essentially. Change things, alter things, shape them to their will. You can have situations like the case of Kryn with the Dragonlance series, from originally TSR turned Wizards of the Coast, with Margaret Weiss Tracy Hickman, where the gods basically decided to punish mortals by dropping what amounted to a mountain on a particular city, Ishtar, which basically created a large sea, the Blood Sea, and also caused various bits of flooding, which created the I don't remember what was that spot again. I gotta look at my map. It's been a while since I've looked at these. There we go. Cool. That'll work. Can I just have this in big form, please? Darn it. Okay, give me just give me the darn image in the big form. Okay, there we go. This is not a great one, but it'll do. Open image, new tab. There we go. That's better. Now I can read this. Okay. So it basically created the Blood Sea of Ishtar, in the process created multiple islands off in the northeast, flooded some areas, creating the New Sea and the Straits of Chalsea and all that sort of stuff. Essentially created the Straits of Algani, which created southern and northern Urgoth, separated from the mainland as islands, and created the Plains of Dust in the south. So basically the gods essentially massively altered the geography. So you had divine intervention that is greatly changing how the world looks from a geographic perspective. Even at a more basic level, if there's a world, if we have a secondary world where that was created by divinities, then presumably those divinities are shaping it, creating the geography however they wish, just from the very beginning. And they might come back and they might make changes, alterations, other things later on. And this can account for odd stuff. This could account for things that are that violate what we would consider to be the laws of geography. That could include things like exotic geography, which we'll get to a bit later. That could have a lot of different effects with things, and that could have essentially imagination is the limit, because you're dealing with divinities, divine power that can do essentially whatever the heck they want in most cases, depending on what limitations the creator has put on divinities within that world and within that setting. Because in some settings, the divinities may have less power, may have less authority, may have less contact with the world. For example, we'll take so Kryn's deities, Kryn's gods have a lot of immediate, direct potential influence on the world. They can act upon the world in various ways, at various levels. They can't come into the world, but they can act upon it in a lot of different methods and means. Comparatively, the gods in Stephen Brust's Dragera books don't really act upon the world at all in terms of geography or shaping things. They are more acting through people than anything else. And there are various reasons for that. They go back into the lore of the world and all this sort of stuff. Other worlds may fall somewhere. You may have worlds where the divinities are completely hands off, so they're not able to act upon things after the moment of creation. That sort of thing. All depends on what we're going for the kind of feel of the setting and the world and the nature of divinity and all of that sort of stuff. The next kind of easy one, once we get past the divine level, we move down a little bit, and this also depends on how the world is set up, as everything in here does, is magic can be used depending on the type of magic system that's in place, depending on how powerful it is, how strong it is, or was in some cases, because we do have settings where magic has kind of gone into a kind of receded or gone into a bit of a recession in terms of the amount of power it has. Magic can potentially be used to alter and change the world. Now, there are lots of different ways that can happen. That could be done purposely. It can be done incidentally. It can be done just by the presence of magic itself. So Middle-earth is a weird situation because we have a semi-divine being, Morgoth, who is essentially a fallen god / angel figure for all intents and purposes, who alters the world through his power when he's in a more or less quasi-mortal form. So he's in the world and he's altering it, so we get that it's a kind of divide between magic and divine. We can have situations where we can take a look at, say, I don't remember if, let me see real quick. Yes, spells, there we go, cool. In other settings and in various game systems, And I'm seeing if there's anything like this going on here. Not really. Okay. So this is less common in, say, double checking that. Oh, no, we still have that. We still have that in some levels, some places. Okay, cool. So with things like D&D or GURPS, for example, as the two that I'm going to know best in the magic systems, there are spells generally high level for D&D purposes, but kind of highish level, even though there aren't levels for GURPS, that can alter the world, the geography of the world, and some of them in larger or smaller forms. So when they get to like 7th level for D&D spells, you've got things like, let's see here. We've got things like whirlwind, which is essentially tornadoes. That can, obviously, tornadoes affect the geography, affect the land in various ways. We have things like, we get to 8th level, we have earthquake, which alters geography. It's only about a 500-foot range, or area, but still, that's going to have effects on geography. We have tsunami. Same thing. It only lasts for about 36 seconds, but these are things that can potentially alter the geography of the setting or of the world. Wish also comes into play there. That can alter geography on a very, very fundamental level. And then there are various powers from various creatures that can potentially do things. To a lesser degree, you've got things like Move Earth that can have an effect on smaller scale. For GURPS terms, you've got things like Earthquake, Volcano. I'm trying to think of the other ones off the top of my head. I don't need to go off the top of my head because I've got the spell list here somewhere. Let's see, Gaming. There we go. And GURPS. And did I put that under? Nope, Magic Spell Charts right there. Beautiful. You got things like Volcano under the, if this actually loads, thank you, go away. And you've got things like, let's see, Air College doesn't really have much in that regard for their, I guess, we've got Sandstorm, which can move things, which can cause some issues in that regard. We got Windstorm, which can cause some issues in that regard. As far as changing some geographic elements. We have... Why won't this move? Why is this not responding? Okay. I know under Earth Fire there's Volcano, where you can basically create a volcano for all intents and purposes. There's also Move Terrain, Alter Terrain. There's... What else is in there? Earthquake. Yeah, Earthquake and Volcano is there. What else was there? There are a bunch of different ones that can essentially modify the geography, even just a small area, and have an effect on various things. In a bigger scale, actually I'm going to check real quick because I don't remember what plant has in there. Because there may even be ones for doing some plant-related stuff. Nope, not really. No, something that's like mass growing of plants. So, on a different scale, there is, as far as magic affecting the world, it's more of just the presence of magic. We can take a look at, I'm going to go back to one of my favorite authors, Ilona Andrews, who, in the Kate Daniels setting, basically, magic has come back into the world, Earth. and it's coming back in sort of waves. But whenever a magic wave hits, the natural world, nature loves magic, feeds on magic like crazy. So whenever a magic wave hits, forests start growing like crazy. They just start going full on, forests, plants feed on magic and absolutely love it. Like, Miracle Grow on steroids. And they just start going crazy. So that you may have an entire old growth forest pops up overnight, or over the course of a day or two. But it looks like it's been there for hundreds of years. So in this case, that world magic is drastically affecting geography in a lot of ways. Where you go to bed one night with a field outside the house, and and by morning you've got 60-foot trees surrounding the house, that sort of thing. So magic definitely altering, affecting, shifting the geography of the world, and that's in a primary world setting as well. So we can play around with some of those things. It's an open magic world. I refer to it as a magipocalypse world, where an apocalypse has occurred, but the apocalypse is magic coming back into the world. So you got those things coming into play. One that's a little more close to home is technology. We are now we've been for a long time, altering geography through technology. When we've been doing things like strip mining, blasting the tops off of mountains and mining stuff from them. We've been creating lakes with quarries and all that sort of thing. We have been doing all kinds of different, we've been doing, using technology, using tools to do things like irrigation and reclaiming bits of desert into, well, we say reclaiming, but turning places of desert into viable fields and whatnot. When we talk about in the UAE and parts of Saudi Arabia, they are creating artificial islands to put apartments and casinos and stuff on. When we look at draining bogs to Venice is a classic example of changing the geography, and that goes back to the Roman era, where people basically built the city in a swamp and have been kind of dredging it and reclaiming bits of it for a long time. Same goes for I want to say it's Alexandria in Egypt, that's been doing some reclamation from the Mediterranean. You get that all over the place. So we've been using technology for a long time, hundreds of years, thousands of years, to alter geography in various ways. Magic or divine intervention just makes it faster and can be more exotic. Obviously we can't technologically make things like islands floating in the sky. Magic can. We can't necessarily make certain things work, but that magic can kind of do. But technology, we've been modifying our geography through the use of technology for many, many thousands of years. Even we're looking at things like forestry, the lumber industry, these sorts of things, which goes back, 6, 7, 8,000 years. Irrigation goes back 6, 7, 8,000 years. With these things, we are modifying the geography of the place around us. So modifying geography through technology, through magic, through divine intervention, is basically just modifying through technology, but on a faster level and possibly on a more creative level in some regards. So that brings us to the big question. Why does geography have anything to do with society? We should all know this to some degree. but we don't often necessarily think about it and how important it is, partially because we have modified our geography so much through technology that we don't necessarily think about it too much anymore. And I'm just folding up my stuff so that my notes are easier to read. If that's any kind of noise you get there. So at the very basic level, geography shapes society on a lot of different levels. At the most basic, geography is going to determine what resources are available to a budding society. So if we have a city, if we have a society that is coming out of a village, we'll say, that is in the mountains, they're going to have different different resources available than a village that comes to be on a, we'll say, a coastline somewhere. And that's going to be in terms of their the raw materials available to them. That's going to come in terms of food availability. That's going to come in terms of potentially even water availability and things like sanitation and this sort of stuff. So if we're in the mountains, we're obviously going to have, we'll say it's a mountain valley, so we can do some farming and stuff. But we're obviously going to have easy access to stone for construction and whatnot. We're also going to have relatively easy access probably to different minerals, potentially metals, depending on the type of mountains we're dealing with. If we are on, but we may or may not have easy access to things like rivers. Hopefully we'll have some kind of water source because we want to build our village or city near a water source. But at the very least, we're going to have a lot of easy access to stone and to various metals, minerals, that sort of thing. On the other hand, our coastal village, depending on what kind of coast it is, we're going to say maybe I'm going to go with a coastal village in a place kind of like, we'll go with the southern U.S. coast, where it's not particularly rocky. Actually, I'll go with more of we'll go really, really southern U.S. coast, where it's more marshy, more marshland type coast. We're not going to necessarily have stone to work with in a lot of cases for construction, that sort of thing. We're probably going to have a reasonable amount of wood, so there's going to be a lot more wood construction versus stone construction. There's going to be more things like wooden palisades, wooden houses, possibly thatch for tops, possibly wood shingles versus stone walls and that sort of thing. And that's going to have different effects in terms of maintaining heat, maintaining cool temperatures. That's going to have different effects regarding things like vermin, like rats and all that sort of thing getting through and all that sort of stuff. That's also going to affect what can be grown, what can be raised. Obviously, marsh water is not going to be too big an issue. We're going to have rivers coming in. We're going to do things. We're probably going to be boiling water, that sort of stuff, all that, whatever happens to come into play there. When we're dealing, if we have like a marsh coastline, we're going to have different foods coming into play than if we had a, say, mountain valley village or culture. Because we're going to have different regions, different setups, so that ultimately we are going to have different things available. When we're dealing with our, say, village in the marshy coastline, then we're going to have things like more fish, more reptilian, likely have more fish, more reptilian type availability for proteins. Whereas if we're in the mountain, we may have more things like goat or birds and that sort of stuff. Probably have birds in both cases, just different kinds of birds. So when we want that geography, we want to think about that geography, we're thinking about what resources are going to be available to this society, to this culture. based on the geography around it. This goes also to looking over my left shoulder. This can get us into anybody who has played Settlers of Catan, where the most important thing before the game even starts is placement of your first settlement, because that determines what resources you have available to you, what resources you pick up immediately, and the likelihood of picking up certain resources as things go. And then throughout the game, it depends heavily on where you're putting your placement of your settlements is very important for geography. So we can think about that to some degree as well. It's essentially thinking about what is available to these people who are going to be in this society, this culture, whatever it is, and how is that going to shape how they do things, like even at the basic level, like what they eat, much less what they build with, what kind of contact they have with the outside world. If we're in a mountain valley and it gets lots of snows and whatnot, then for a certain amount of the year, they're probably going to lose contact with the outside world, unless there is some aerial or magical means of travel coming into play. If they are a coastal setup, they are probably going to have a lot of boat travel, and they are probably going to have a fair amount of contact with anybody else along coasts, because they're going to be able to row, sail, whatever, along coast or up and down a river. That kind of comes in and forms that kind of marsh coastal area. So these resources are going to not only determine things like what they have available to them to work with, but also what kind of contact they have with the outside world. That's going to be an important thing to look at as the society develops and grows. We'll say there's a reason why we look at kind of historically our own world, taking a look at up through probably at least the 18th century into the 19th century. Cities that were founded during those times were founded in one of two places, typically speaking. They were founded near water sources, particularly rivers, because it's travel, it's trade, it's sanitation, and it's clean water that we need to survive. Or they were founded in strategic spots to control a particular mountain pass, or to control a particular choke point for defensive purposes. This would go back to, generally speaking, pre-modern eras, or to control particular waterways, or whatever it happened to be, trade routes, roads. So generally speaking, they were created for one of those two reasons. We do have other ones that were, say, market towns, that were a convenient spot for people for say farmers and villages to bring things into one area and trade with each other. But even those, the reason they're convenient is because they were on easy to make roads or along rivers that were easy to get to. So we have what's available to the people, what's available to the culture of the society makes a big difference based on the geography of what's going on. And most of the ones that were created due to strategic purposes were predominantly created by either a standing military for the nation, built around a fort, kind of generally growing out of a fort, for the purposes of supporting it, because forts need food, they need metalworking, they need all that sort of stuff. Or they were built around a castle, which is essentially a fort for all intents and purposes. And then kind of grew out of that as support for whatever it happened to be. That ties in nicely with, hi, how are things? Good morning, and thanks for joining. You mean the room behind me? I'm assuming by the background. Yeah, it's not really background, just my office. So when we're looking at shaping society, other things we're shaping society, resources translates nicely into things like trade and travel. Because most towns, most villages, most settlements are built on places where people can get to it fairly easily. Whether it be by some sort of road or collection of roads. We see this particularly in places like if you look at some of the various mercantile settlements along what used to be known as the Silk Road. A lot of them were built up there because they were convenient spots for caravans or other traveling groups to have breaks. They usually also had water supply or water source there, but they were there predominantly for purposes of trade. Other cases, we're going to look at the geography affecting travel, where we want either ground that is relatively easy to put roads in, or rivers, water travel, coastlines. But we could also have weird stuff going on if there's magical travel or aerial travel coming into play. When we're looking at things like location, if we have, and geography, if we have a spot that's really heavily cut off, then that's going to affect how the trade and travel works for the particular society. If it's difficult to get to, they're going to be more isolated. There's going to be less trade travel. It's going to be more insular and working with whatever resources they have available. If they are easy to get to, we'll say like, let's go with, say, why not, like Florence or Venice or Rome, for the older world, for the kind of, we'll say, ancient to medieval versions. You've got a bunch of different things like they're kind of central, and they're by big waterways. They're by rivers. They're by sea. It's easy to get to them. You can get lots of goods in and out and all that sort of thing. So basically what I'm looking at, or what I'm talking about, is not necessarily future, but is as fantasy world building and the effects of geography on society. And things we can do with geography, depending on whether we're doing a primary world that is Earth or a secondary world that is not Earth. And various things to kind of think about with that. So, how geography affects the resources for this society, how geography affects trade and travel. And again, that's going to depend partially on the technology for the setting. It's also going to depend on the magic level for the setting and what's going on with it. It's going to depend on, for trade and travel, it's also going to depend on, or it's going to affect how kind of insular or how kind of open cosmopolitan the society is, the culture is. Because if we have, say, a culture society that's in a mountain valley, that is, because of weather or whatnot, cut off from everyone else for, say, 4 months out of the year, 5 months out of the year, due to mountain passes being impossible to travel, and land is your only travel route, then they're going to become very insular, very isolated. Whereas if we have a city like, say, Rome, or to use a fantasy one, Waterdeep from the Forgotten Realms setting, or what's another good one? We'll say, we'll use China Mieville's New Crobuzon, or a bunch of other places that are essentially coastal or near coastal trade cities. They're going to end up being more cosmopolitan because they have a lot more land routes in, they have a lot more water routes in. They are places where people from various cultures, various, in the fantasy setting, species, etc., come together and have interactions and whatnot, which has a major effect on trade, which has a major effect on travel, which has a major effect on society. Another one where geography comes into play is going to be, for society, is building out of that is culture. When we have a kind of geographically cut off society, society, then it's going to have a very insular culture in many respects, unless there are other means of transportation, other ways of getting in and out of the place, which can happen. We have a lot of different possibilities there. It's because when we introduce things like magic and steampunk type technology, alternative technologies, then that gives us other methods of transportation and other ways of determining whether a place is cut off or not cut off, isolated or not. The geography heavily affects culture in so many different ways. Which one do I find possible in the real world? That's kind of a rough question in some regards, because most settings are to some degree or another based on real world settings, partially because that's what we know as writers, as readers, as creators, gaming creators and whatnot. So it's easy to draw parallels or to use them as inspiration. I would say one of the most near future, I don't generally speculate in that regard at this point in time. But I would say, as far as most likely, most kind of quote unquote realistic for all intents and purposes, I would probably lean toward Lee Bardugo's world from Shadow and Bone slash Six of Crows, because she's very heavily, very clearly creating that world off of 18th, 19th century European setups. So cyberpunk would not be fantasy. Cyberpunk would be science fiction, with certain exceptions. Exceptions like Shadowrun, which is where we get a science fantasy or fantasy cyberpunk setup. There are a couple others like that out there that the names of which are eluding me at the moment. But cyberpunk would definitely be would definitely be sci-fi rather than fantasy. That said, there are future fantasies out there. A good example is Ilona Andrews with the Kate Daniels series, where there's a Magipocalypse. Or another good one, Nalini Singh's, what was the series called? I referenced this, Psy Changeling series. Her Psy Changeling series is kind of a near future fantasy setup. I guess to some degree, to a certain degree, too, I would suggest that, well, it's more of an alt history modern. Andrews's Hidden Legacy series is kind of an alt history / modern / near future, depending on where it's kind of set at. In those cases, kind of circling back around, it does get into society and connecting the society with the geography and such, because those are all very heavily influenced by things with that. No, I have not played Baldur's Gate, but I am extremely familiar with the Forgotten Realms setting from decades of gaming tabletop gaming background. When we look at culture and geography, we do have that fun bit or these things where it is they heavily shape or society or geography heavily shapes the culture. So we got both mentioned trade travel. That's going to affect things as far as isolated versus cosmopolitan. We take a look at, say, if we have a, let's go with that way, even taking two different places with similar broad geography. So we'll say a city in a equatorial desert. Back that up, we'll say an Egyptian city, for example, use a real world example, in a desert, versus a, say, northwestern Chinese city in a desert. The Sahara versus the Gobi Desert. Even with those broad similarities of these are cities and deserts, there are very different cultures coming out of things because of the rest of the geography. Rest of the geography, we've got a hot desert against a ocean, against a sea, with a major river going through, versus a cold desert that is surrounded by mountains and such. And those are going to affect the culture in many various ways because of how the weather, how the geography affects the weather and these sorts of issues. So we got a lot of things going on there that are going to kind of mess with things. That also comes back to, as I mentioned earlier, what food is available when we get to resources and how the resources are going to affect the culture and how the culture works. We take a look at, say, let's take a look at that one. We have the various, we'll say, Inuit cultures of northern Canada versus the culture of, say, parts of Russia. Areas where, above the Arctic Circle, areas where it's very cold, very snowy, very all that stuff most of the year. Many of the Inuit cultures developed construction using ice, the so-called igloo and whatnot coming out of things. On the other hand, Russian cultures, because of how Russia is set up and all these other things and that they do have and whatnot, have heavy wood construction. And they tend to heavily decorate that wood. Wood carving became a massively intricate wood carving became a extremely advanced art and artistic form within that culture and society. Likewise, architecturally, you get very, very steep peaked roofs to let snow slough off, so it's not all building up in one spot. You don't get flat roofs when you get places like, when you're going in traditional architecture above an Arctic Circle or near an Arctic Circle, places that got a lot of snow, you tend not to have flat roofs. You tend to have very, very steep peaks, very, very steep roofs. This affects the thing. Versus if you have, say, we take a look at Egyptian construction and whatnot, or Pueblo for southwestern U.S., and you get a lot of flat roofs because these are basically places where there is no snow, places where you get rain, but you don't sometimes, but you predominantly don't have a lot of precipitation and whatnot, so you don't need things to kind of slough off. And that totally changes the feel of the setting of the place and culture in a lot of ways. Tied in with these, obviously, geography is going to affect things like defense and expansion of the society and culture. If we have geography plays a big role in terms of natural defenses and in terms of opportunity for expansion. So that basically, we go back to that village in the... we'll go back to that village in the mountains that's more or less cut off from a lot of things. they're going to be fairly well defended. If the only way to get to the village and the only way to get to the society is through a single mountain pass that is blocked for a certain amount of the year, it's going to be pretty easy to keep themselves safe from outside powers. It's also going to be very difficult to expand. Once they reach the ends of the valley, they're pretty much stuck because they're kind of bottlenecked. On the other hand, that coastal village has lots of room to expand, but is also fairly vulnerable because of its geography. So geography is going to have a big effect in that regard in terms of are there natural defenses? Are there natural blocks to expansion? Are there natural paths to expansion? Is there room for the society to grow? Or is it going to be somewhat contained because of its geography? Likewise, that may say that the geography says, okay, yeah, you need to have some means of some, what's the word I'm looking for? Some method of, you might need some method of artificial defenses in some regards, or some means of artificially moving beyond the area in order to expand. Now that could be, say, our mountain society, for example, could expand into the mountains, could literally dig its way into the mountains and create an underground expansion, kind of dwarf-like, classic fantasy dwarf-like. Alternately, it could, say, widen the pass, possibly, and expand out that way. Could create a new mountain pass that connects to a valley that would be otherwise unconnected. Could create some form of aerial travel, build up some form of aerial travel that allows it to go over the mountains and get out fairly easily. Could develop magical travel. So it may have to find some means to, if that society wishes to expand, it's probably going to need some kind of artificial means to do so. On the other hand, our coastal village, that society, that culture can expand pretty much as it wants. But it's probably going to want some kind of artificial defenses because it doesn't really have very much as far as natural goes. That said, there are ways there could be natural things. From sea, there could be natural, a reef that ships need to be guided through, that otherwise could rip out the bottoms of ships. There could be potentially mountains on the land side that help protect the city. There could be a lot of different things going on. For our purposes, this geography, this example, I'm going to say that it's basically essentially open plains for several miles on the land side of the village for the coastal one, just for demonstration purposes. And with all of that, of course, geography shapes history. Because geography shapes things like trade, travel, because it shapes things like defense, expansion, it shapes history. And it shapes the history of the society, the culture of the area. Because when we are looking at what the society can do, where it can go, that is basically its history. What it has available to it in terms of ideas, in terms of contact, in terms of technological development, in terms of magical development, it's going to basically be affected by its geography and how that geography is dealt with, is approached. It may, our mountain village may end up developing crazy levels of mining technology and metalworking and stoneworking, which is going to have an impact on its history and its connections with various things. It's an easily defensible location. That means it's probably not going to be invaded that much. So anything that comes into play there is going to be, contexts are going to be largely probably through trade. Unless outside technology allows people, or magic allows people to come in and that sort of thing through other means, of course. So the culture, the setup, the geography is really going to affect that history, as well as the culture, as well as the resources available and these sorts of things. And all of those are going to really kind of be tied into each other. But they're all impacted heavily by the geography of the setting, of the society, of the culture. When a culture, for example, has not been, yeah, we can use this example. So I'll use two different places as examples. I'm going to use Scotland, and I'm going to use Poland. Actually, two places I have descendants from. So Scotland is, so much of Scotland is mountains. So much of Scotland is, especially when you get to the Highlands, is considered largely impassable, particularly when you're dealing with things like armies, particularly when you're dealing with pre-modern armies. So what did the Scots do? When invaders came, whether they be Nordic invaders or English or whatnot, they fled to they retreated to the Highlands, and the invading armies just kind of gave up and decided it's not worth the effort. Even the Romans decided it's not worth the effort. Thus, Hadrian's Wall. And that would be the Picts at that point in time, certainly. But still, the geography is still the same. It's still the Scottish geography, the mountains, and all that sort of thing. Conversely, we've got Poland, which is less geographically difficult, a lot less geographically difficult to travel through. And we can see that in their history. Over the course of the last, we'll say 1,000 years, we'll go 2,000 years, why not in both cases, not many people have tried invading Scotland because it's mountains, it's difficult, or Switzerland for that matter, because it's difficult, it's surrounded by mountains. In the Switzerland's case, it has relatively narrow mountain passes that are easily defendable. And it has developed a particular history based off of that, and a particular culture based off of that. That is the sort of neutrality culture and all that sort of thing. Conversely, Poland is easy to get across, relatively speaking. Poland has been invaded by basically everybody in Europe at one point in time or another. Napoleon invaded it for France, Germany invaded it, Russia's invaded it, Austria invaded it, the Nordic people, Norse invaded it. Everybody's invaded Poland at some point in time. It's kind of been it's a bit of a crossroads in some regards. So the Polish culture has developed a different way in terms of dealing with that historically. There is resistance, there is fighting, all that sort of stuff when there's an invasion. But my Polish grandfather used to joke that the Poles will basically smile as the invader comes into the country, sell them food from roadside stands, and then when their back is turned and there's a convenient brick nearby, deal with the issue of the invasion. And honestly, Polish history, from what I've read of it, seems to pretty well back that up to some degree. We'll kind of like, yeah, come on in. We're used to people coming in. Okay, now when your back is turned, wham. But that geography has affected the history. It's affected the culture. It's affected the society in a lot of different ways. So, let's see. Do I go that way? Do I go that route? Yeah, of course, and this, of course, doesn't take into account. This is working predominantly with our current understanding of what we would consider to be normal geography. Where things get weird is when we're dealing with fantasy, we're dealing with secondary worlds. We can have exotic geography. And if normal geography has an effect on societies and cultures, we can imagine what exotic geography will do, or can do. So, when we have exotic geography, one of the things we are looking at or there are lots of different kinds of exotic geography. I've got 5 big ones that come to mind, and really it's kind of 8, but they're kind of grouped into 5, but they're good examples. So a big one would be one that I like playing with a lot is, or I have liked playing with a lot in the past, is wandering islands, which are basically coming out of the idea, if we take a look back at medieval, early modern to even 18th century sailors and whatnot, we've got this idea of what's called an aspidoshalone. Aspidoshalone, I'm maybe mispronouncing that, but aspidoshalone are basically the giant turtles that are so big that land and trees and such start accruing on their back. The stories go that sailors would mistake them for islands. They'd land on them, trying to get restore fresh water and all that sort of stuff. And then the turtle would dive and kill everybody on board, on top. But wandering islands in fantasy can take a lot of different forms. I've played with the aspidoshalone myself a fair bit, but wandering islands could just be there to wander, under their own power, under some other form of magic or something along those lines. They could be attached to an animal. There's a lot of art that plays around with that as well. There could be a situation of, it could be a sinking and rising island, all kinds of different options. And they're all going to have different effects in terms of the types of society that are built on them. I did even for a while play with an idea that, I didn't go very far with it, but play with an idea of a essentially moving archipelago. A collection, I don't know what that would be. What would a group of a bale or a flotilla? That's what they bales apparently, or a flotilla is apparently the name for a group of sea turtles. So either a bale or a flotilla of aspidoshalone. That basically these islands would all be on the backs of turtles, and these turtles are moving around, and the archipelago just moves all over the place. I even brought an aspido into a urban fantasy setting that I was working on. That basically the turtle island traveled the world slowly, and people kind of kept track of it in the magical community and whatnot. But those are going to have their own kind of things. If your island moves around, if the place your town or your village or your society is built on moves, because the whole island moves, that's going to have an impact on your society and culture in a lot of different ways. That could also be magical means of moving, where it's like teleporting, that sort of thing. People play with that all the time. A good example is the Redhurst Academy, which I had here somewhere. Gaming, D&D. The Redhurst Academy of Magic by, who were these folks again? I've forgotten. Who did Redhurst Academy? By Human Head Studios. Matt Forbeck, Seth Johnson, Timothy Garrettson, David Giulisano, and Paul Tucher. It's available. There's a free version available without the D&D stats. I believe it's RamPG is the search thing for it. But let me double check that before I do. Nope. Yeah, Redhurst Academy is probably the easiest way to put it in. Yeah, that's Matt Forbeck is hosting a version of it, or hosting something for it online. There's a free version PDF. But it's the school essentially teleports to different worlds, which affects the culture of the school and the setting, that society. And the school is a society. So societies can be as big or as small. You can be like as small as a 5-person village. It can be as big as a 2 million, 3 million person city, 10 million person city, or a nation or whatnot. It can be a school. It can be, we have subcultures, sub-societies, all that sort of stuff coming into play as well, that flow around in there. Tied in with the wandering islands is the idea of having flying land, floating land, where instead of having an island wandering the seas, you have an island wandering the ocean or wandering the sky. Sorry, where the island floats in the sky and drifts around and all these sort of things. There was, I don't really see this one too often, although I do see variations on it to the one degree or another. One that I don't remember what it was called. I think it was this. Let me see. Yes. Jordi Bayari had kind of, it would be a adult comic called Encantae, Enchante, whatever, however you want to pronounce it, that basically featured an entire society built on islands floating in the sky. And there have been some other examples of that as well. That one's definitely not one for the under 18 crowd. But there's a lot of there's possibilities floating around in there. Likewise, there are what we might call sky worlds, where there are, which also has kind of bits of land floating in the air or people living on ships, that sort of thing. A good example of that, which I think works both of them, I haven't read that far into them, is Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman's Deathgate Cycle. So Weiss Hickman's Deathgate Cycle uses one world is basically an air world where everything is kind of floating through the air, through the sky, this sort of thing. Actually, technically, that would also work in that case to some degree. To a certain degree, that might also work for Larry Niven's Integral Trees, which is not his best work, but there are a number of issues going on with those. But it's certainly one where we have basically essentially a flying land / sky world type setting in some regards, but in a sci-fi form. Weiss Hickman does tie nicely, though, over to between Sky Worlds and Broken Worlds. So in the Deathgate Cycle, the world, essentially there was going to be there was a nuclear issue going on, as I understand it, and essentially world was going to be destroyed. Some powers came in, did something, separated the world into 4 parts, each a different element, or something to that effect. It's been a long time since I've even looked at any of that world, but it's still out there. Or there's the kids video game, web-based video game, or kind of web-based video game, Wizard 101, which has both of which feature the broken world, where the world has been broken apart into a bunch of different settings, different cultures, different worlds. Wizard 101 links it through what they call the spiral, and each of the kind of component worlds is built around a particular Earth era. So the one world is very Viking, the one world is very kind of medieval-esque, the one is more 19th century London, the one is more ancient Egypt with 19th century London involvement, the one is very Japanese, etc., etc., etc. Like, Shogunate era Japanese. But the thing that links it all is the spiral, and therefore these connection points that where the worlds can be traveled between, the sections can be traveled between through gates, essentially, magical means. Likewise, death gate cycle, the worlds are linked by gates, magical gates. So in these cases with the broken worlds, we either have to have some kind of magical means of getting between them, or some sort of vehicular means of getting between them, probably. Because they're generally not going to be linked by means that people can just kind of walk, unless it's through like a magic gate or something along those lines. But the broken worlds, that kind of geography, very exotic, is going to have a huge impact on social elements and social development. In some ways, each part of the world society is probably going to be somewhat different. They're probably going to be potentially very different. Depends on how long they've been cut off from each other, if they've been cut off from each other, and a whole bunch of other things. Yeah, let's go different types of worlds. Why not? Other types of worlds we see that can come into play there, where geography makes a big difference, would be, say, flat worlds, where the world is flat, not round, where it's a plane, not a sphere. Probably the best fantasy example of that is Terry Pratchett's Discworld. I'll go back to Terry Pratchett a lot. Great author. Where the world is flat. In his case, it's also circular. So what effect did that have on things? Well, there was no north, south, east, or west, because we had north, south, east, west with the globe. So what he had was hubward, that is going toward the center of the literal center of the world, or then he had it wasn't clockwise, counterclockwise. He had something else for those. Let me see. Discworld directions. Yeah, we had hubward, which is toward the center, toward the hub. We had rimward, which is toward the edge. We have turnwise, which is the direction that the planet is turning. And we had widdershins, which is the opposite direction that it's turning, counter to its rotation. So while he has a flat world, he still has it turning in different ways. Presumably, it's turning relatively clockwise, because widdershins is typically counterclockwise in terms of what it means. So presumably, in this case, the world is naturally kind of going like this. Widdershins would be that way. Turnwise would be that way. Hubward would be that way. And rimward would be back that way, since there's no north, south, east, west. So he culturally, that has that level of shift, where we're talking about even the language that we're using is changing because of the geography. It's a classic flat world. There are other potential flat world possibilities out there. He's just a really great example of it. We can do all kinds of things with the flat world. We can mess around with it in lots of different ways. But it's going to have an effect on geography, or on society and such, because that level of, there are going to be edges. You can't just sail, east continuously and come back to the place you started from. You're going to fall off the edge of something, probably. So we have those kind of issues coming into play. Related to that, to some degree, we have another version, which is the ring worlds. This one we typically will see more in sci-fi, but I think they do have a place potentially in fantasy. The classic one is Larry Niven's Ring World, eponymous one, but there are other variations out there. They're kind of a variation on almost a variation on a Dyson sphere, but different. So a Dyson sphere would be completely encapsulating a sun or other light/power source with essentially a artificial world in which the life exists on the inside, not on the outside. So a ring world is like that, but with the sun in the center and the ring kind of built around it. We see variations on this with, say, rings of space stations. We can see this also with what we see in like Star Wars and a few other cases, Clone Wars, for example, Star Wars Clone Wars, and a few other places. We see, taken to an extreme, we do see it in Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda, with the Magog world ship, which is basically a bunch of planets linked to each other physically, surrounding a sun, which is a massive scale version of one. But ring worlds, I think, do have a potential place and potential for use in fantasy setting, because we have divine creation possibilities, we have magic creation possibilities, we have pocket dimensions and that sort of thing, different planes of existence and that sort of thing. That's going to have a hopefully obvious impact on the societies and cultures of that world, where you're going to have, they may or may not be able to see across the ring, depending. The horizon is going to be different, for another thing. How they can interact with each other as far as societies is going to be different. You're basically going to have, say, two directions of travel. You're going to hit the limits of, say, if north and south are going around the ring and east-west are going the width of the ring, then east-west you're going to hit walls pretty quickly, relatively speaking. But north-south, you're going to be having a huge amount of space you can go. So most travel is going to be going north-south. Most expansion is probably going to be going north-south, because you're going to hit walls east-west. So that's going to have a significant impact on societies and cultures. You may have cultures, societies, nations, where all of the nations fill essentially wall to wall on east-west and only have north-south neighbors. That's entirely feasible in that sort of ring world type situation. So those are some things that are floating out there. A couple other weird exotic ones that are relatively common. We've got, I'm going to go back to Michael Moorcock here with his Elric series, where we have a boiling sea, where we have a section of the sea, a section of the ocean that is permanently, continuously boiling, building up steam and all that sort of stuff that causes navigation hazards and whatnot. This becomes a navigation hazard for cultures and societies, particularly ones that are nearby and rely upon sea trade. There's also the possibility, given divine intervention, given magic, that a boiling sea could be a defense, a geographic defense for a culture society. There could be an island in the middle of this sea where we have cultured society built up, and then we have this boiling sea and this essentially wall of steam around it that protects it from the outside world. So we got a couple different things we can play around with in there, and certainly it's going to affect our cultures and our societies. Likewise, in some cases, I take a look at, say, this is going into a really deep dive. We take a look at I don't remember when that came out. I'm going to double check this real quick. When was this created? Was it a long, long time ago? Where's the book? The book. 19... Yeah, so that's basically been untouched. No, there was an entire box set for that. I remember because I owned it. Why is that not mentioned here? That's weird. I'm trying to get a date on the Taladas, Taladas, setting in Kryn for Dragonlance, and unfortunately, the Dragonlance wiki does not mention Talatus box set. I don't think. I don't think that was the set for it, and I know I had it for a while. But we're talking roughly 1990. It's about 35 years ago. There was a creation of a new continent on Kryn, second continent. Ancelon is the main one. The second one was called Talatus. And in the center of Talatus, pretty much the dead center of it, the whole setting looks kind of like a Coriolis effect in some ways. It's kind of a weird thing. I'm going to go ahead and put a link in chat because what the heck. The whole continent looks kind of like a Coriolis effect, but in the dead center is the burning sea. It's a giant sea of lava, basically, with some like cooled magma type lands on the sides and all, or not magma, but some cooled areas on the edges. That has affected and does involve the culture of the area, because there was Gnomish culture and whatnot, and there are other folks who are in that area who use various devices, including things like what's the word I'm looking for? The metallic ships or metal connected ships to navigate the lava sea and do various things with that. So there are things going through there, floating through there, that play around or come into play. So these has an effect on society, this lava sea, and it has an effect on trade, it has an effect on contact between cultures and all that sort of stuff because of the nature of that piece of geography. It's not particularly common. When we look at, lava seas aren't particularly common when we look at the genre, but they are something that would be a piece of exotic geography that would have a serious and significant effect on people and how things work. So just some things that float around in there. These are good ones to play with. These are things that we can kind of mess with, hopefully provide some inspiration potentially when we're thinking about different secondary world geography. We're thinking about how the world works, how the non-Earth world operates. And more importantly, how that affects the cultures and societies that we're working with, which it should, in all sorts of different ways. And this is just kind of tip of the iceberg. There's all kinds of different levels we can go with that, in terms of how things get affected and such. But to kind of wrap up, I'm going to go ahead and shift gears a little bit into real world geography, or primary worlds, Earth-based worlds. So Earth-based worlds, we have real-world geography. We can do different things with that. We are kind of stuck with real-world geography. So if we're setting something on Earth, urban fantasy, for example, or post-apocalyptic fantasy, or whatever it happens to be, we are limited to kind of what local geography is like and whatever we're setting this at. So it's going to take research. It's going to take looking into things and how does a city work and all that sort of stuff. But we have a couple different things we can use to approach that. We can make use of real places. That's a pretty common one. You take a look at, say, you look at, say, Alona Andrews. You look at Michael Scott with Immortal Secrets, or Secrets of the Immortal Nicholas Flamel. You look at what's his name? You look at Butcher with the Dresden Files. You look at Hearn with the Iron Druid series. You look at even I don't think he does that fictional one there. He does something else. You look at many of our urban fantasy paranormal romance writers will pick a real place, a real city that they want to focus in on, and they then need to know that city, whether it be New Orleans, whether it be Chicago, whether it be London, whether it be Paris, whether it be whatever city it happens to be. Need to know the city, need to know the geography. Some people get around this by creating fictional cities. Charles DeLint is a good example with what the heck was that town again? What city did he make up? He made up the town of, and I'm totally blanking on the name now. I should remember. Newford, which is a fictitious North American city that seems to be set in, could be the US or Canada, predominantly uses Canadian laws, if I recall correctly, but Newford is a fictitious city. We take a look at the TV series Lost Girl, which is set in an unnamed fictional city. Never gets named at all. It could be in southern Canada, could be northern US. It seems to probably be northern Canada, based on some travel, probably southern Canada, probably off to the west, because for a while there's some travel into, I want to say Washington State, maybe California. We also have people who and we have fictitious cities all over the place in the Urban Fantasy Paranormal Romance series settings. We even have real places like, say, Atlanta that get modified and changed by, say, apocalypses. Lona Andrews, Kate Daniels. We get fictitious towns and villages pretty often. Charlene Harris, Night Watch. I think it was Night Watch or Day Watch or something along those lines. What was that called? Not those books. Her other books. Midnight Texas. Yeah. Midnight Texas, which is the name of the whole series as well. With Midnight Crossroad and Day Shift. Yes, Day Shift is the second book, Night Shift is the third book. I did remember that correctly. Just wrong order. But Midnight Texas doesn't actually exist. So she made up this fictitious town and whatnot to put this in. One author, whose name I'm blanking on totally. I haven't read her in a little while. I can't remember the name of it now, but she created not just a fictitious city, but also a fictitious county in Arizona, New Mexico area to set her fictitious town in. So when we're looking at those, we do want to think about, can they be accessed by normal people, or are they only accessed by magical beings? If they can be accessed by anybody, what effect does that have on other counties, other states, places around them, towns, cities, whatever? If they cannot be accessed, then how do people interact with it or not interact with it, as the case may be? There may be things in place that cause normal people, non-magical beings, to sort of avoid the place or ignore the place in whatever means or fashion is possible. Some people go on to even the levels of fictitious countries coming into play. A couple good examples. We've got Cassandra Clare with it became the show Shadowhunters, Mortal Instruments, which has an entire fictitious country in Europe that people just kind of ignore, that non-magical beings can't find, don't see, so they just kind of ignore it and pretend it's not there. It doesn't appear on any maps or any of that stuff. What's his name? Manatee, what was the name of the author? Put in that thing. Manatee Gal, that's the name of it. Avram Davidson created an entire fictitious country in South America. That I can't remember the name of off the top of my head. Let me see. British Hidalgo, which is a fictitious version of the Honduras, basically. So he created an entire new country in South America to set his stories in. And when we have a fictitious country, we get the best of both worlds in some respects. It's a primary world Earth, so everybody's familiar with various histories around it and around of the area of the various neighbors and countries and other places around it. They're familiar with the physics and all those sorts of things. They're familiar with geography. But because it is a fictitious country, we can create whatever geography we want for it within certain boundaries, because we still want to be relatively true to the area that it's in. So we create a fictitious country or fictitious state or fictitious island or whatever it happens to be in, say, the area of the U.S. known as the Pacific Northwest. We can get the feel of, say, Washington or British Columbia without actually being Washington State or British Columbia. And we can kind of mess with it a little bit ourselves, not having to necessarily... We can get the vibe of British Columbia / Washington State without having to actually have everything accurate to those. So we kind of get a little bit of best of both worlds in that regard. But we have to be careful with it and thinking about what exactly is going on around us, how is this interacting with other places that are connected to it or attached to it or near it. Easiest way to deal with that for a primary world setting is make the fictitious country an island, because we have lots of space in the ocean where we can throw things and just say that there are paranormal reasons why people aren't familiar with this. Or we can say, yep, it's there, it's in the middle of the North Atlantic, and it's a country, people can go there, normal people can get there, magical beings can get there, but it's an island in the middle of the North Atlantic. It doesn't really have too much impact on a lot of things in that regard. Or it's off the routes that, say, ships used to use getting back and forth, or maybe it became something that ships used in the 1800s, 1900s. Maybe or maybe not, depends on what we're looking at and what kind of connection we want. And of course, to wrap things up more or less, we have the realm of portal fantasies, which doesn't really affect our geography too much, but it can be a means of, or so-called isekai settings, where we're moving from one culture to another, and those cases we can potentially mess around with things a little bit. Ilona Andrews has one where they do a little bit of messing around with that, based on mixing geography, mixing history, with the Edge series, where there are two parallel worlds. We've got Earth that we know, and then there's also the fairy, which is Earth we don't know, where history is different and geography is slightly different. But we can have some things along those lines. We play around with different geographies based on having our main character or PCs or whatnot having their kind of take on things based on their understanding of our world. Terry Brooks, Magic Kingdom for Sale is a good example there. The Die comics that spawned Die RPG and whatnot, definitely another good example there. All kinds of different examples out there of this, and different effects that come out of it. Die RPG, the Die comics are also a very interesting one in terms of the geographic elements of world build, because the entire world is basically a 20-sided die. and every nation on it is essentially triangular. Every geographic region on it is triangular, and they are all kind of self-contained, with very solid boundaries between them that people cross, and physical boundaries that people cross and such. But you may have like a Tolkien style forest on, say, we'll say the 14 face of the die, and then on the 6 face of the die, which is right next to it, you have a Arabian Nights inspired desert setting. So it's a very interesting geographic world build from that perspective, because there's all kinds of fun, weird things that are going on with it. It's also a very dark and kind of, for lack of a better term, depressing setting in a lot of respects, but that's sort of the purpose of the point of the setting in its ways. So I'm actually pretty happy with that. I don't know if I know we've had one person who seems to have been lurking for the entire time. If you've got anything you want to kind of toss in or bring up while I'm here, or throw out there. If not, that's fine. Lurking is fine. I do a lot of lurking myself. Nope. Okay. So on that note, I will just kind of give my usual sign off, and I'll find somebody to go jump into. So good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever it is for you. I'm Brent, an author, amateur world builder, writing educator. You can find me as werewolf_dr on Threads, Instagram, Patreon, Ko-Fi, YouTube, as well as here, or werewolf-dr on Bluesky, which is where I'm spending more time these days. Otherwise, I'm glad to have you here, lurking or otherwise. And hopefully see everybody next week, which will be on next Wednesday at 12:30 Eastern Standard PM, that is. And I think I'm going to go ahead and try to jump over to, let's see, where is everything again? That is all here. Yep, we're going to go ahead and jump on over to, let's see, who's on? There are folks that I'm actually following and such on there, so let's go over to there. Because what the heck? Why not? Two, 1, 0, and go.